Hey, what's up everyone and welcome to Daily Code Buffer. In this video, we are going to create a complete full stack application using Spring Boot as a backend and Next.js as a front end. So in the backend, we are going to create a Spring Boot application with Spring.jpa and we are going to use the MySQL database to store all our data. We are going to create a different bunch of APIs to get the data, to delete the data, create the data, update the data, and so on. So we'll be creating the backend application, and to move on to the front end application, we are going to create the Next.js application. Next.js is nothing but the framework on top of the React library. So I can say that it is what a Spring Boot is to the Spring framework. That's what a Next.js is to the React library. So all the configurations and everything that you have to do in your React application, all those stuffs are directly inbaked in the Next.js. So we are going to use that today. And we are also going to implement the Next.js authentication with the NextAuth. So we will be only able to access our application once you are authenticated by any of the authentication provider. So for this particular video, we are going to use Facebook as an authentication provider, but you can use any of the authentication provider. There are a bunch of authentication default provided by the nextauth.js, and we can also implement the custom one as well. So that's been pretty it. That's what we are going to build today. If you are interested, stick around and practice it while we are developing the application. That will make you to understand both Spring Boot and Next.js and how both the application work cohesively. So let me just show you the demo of the application that we are going to build today. So if you go to this particular screen, if you come over here, this is the application. You can see that I'm not logged into the application yet, and at that particular time it is asking me for sign in. Once I click on the sign in over here, it will ask me to log in with any of the authentication provider. Currently I have only implemented Facebook, but if you have implemented more, all that particular list will come here. So let's go ahead and sign in with Facebook. And here you can see that I have signed in with the Facebook. I have already logged in with the browser, so it didn't ask me for the credentials. But if you have not, it will ask you for the correct credentials. I'll show you that as well. You can see that my name is coming, my profile picture is coming, everything. If I show you in the incognito mode, if you click on sign in, if you go to sign in with Facebook, you can see that your Facebook page will come. You have to log in with Facebook. So if I give my credentials over here, so yeah, you can see that it will try to log in with the Facebook. It is asking me for the two-factor authentication and everything. But you get the gist, right? This way you will be asked to log in with your Facebook account. I've already logged in from here. Now you can see that I have the list of users available. You can edit it, delete it, and add the new user as well. So let's try to create a new user. I'll just add user 1, user 1, 2, and user@email.com. I'll add the user. You can close it. Okay, clear as well. This particular model will close and you can save it as well. Once you save it, you can see that your entry will be populated over here, and you can edit the entry as well. Suppose instead of user 1, I need user 2, and you can save it. It will be updated to the user 2 as well. And if you want, you can delete as well. That particular entry will be deleted. So that's the entire application. And if you click on this particular icon, you can see that it is showing that click to log out. Once you click over here, your application will be logged out and you will be asked to sign in again. So that's the simple flow that we are going to build today with entire authentication, all the session management and everything using Next.js and Spring Boot. Now before we start developing our application, let's talk about the Brilliant, who are kindly sponsoring this video. I've already talked about Brilliant in my previous videos as well. I've been learning the fundamentals of cryptocurrency from the Brilliant, and I've also started learning the quantum computing from the brilliant.org. It helps me to understand the fundamentals of each and every topic that I'm interested in. There are a bunch of topics available, and once you go through the fundamentals, once you go through the courses, it will prompt you for the quizzes and the different questionnaires and everything. So whatever you are learning, you are instantly memorizing it. You are instantly saving all the information in your brain, because it's not like you are going through bunch of stuffs and that's it. You are going through a lot of things. You will understand everything. There is a visual representation of everything. Whatever you are learning, everything have a detailed theory as well, and it will help you to understand in depth all the things, all the fundamentals. So that is why I love Brilliant platform to learn all the fundamentals. Now along with all those courses, there are a bunch of courses available. There are more than 60 plus courses available, ranging from your basic stems, your quantum computing, your cryptocurrency, your computer networks, fundamentals of algorithm, computer memory management, and lot more. There are a lot of courses. So if you are interested in learning the fundamentals, the root, the basics of a particular topic, then I would recommend you to join brilliant.org. You can sign up for these courses for free and you can start learning all those particular courses. And if you go to this mentioned link, brilliant.org/dailycodebuffer, first 200 people will get a 20% off on their annual premium membership. So if you are interested, check out the first link in the description below. Now let's get back to the video. Now what we will do, we will create the two applications, that is a Spring Boot application for our backend, and we will create the next application and we will build everything. First, we will complete the build of a backend, we will create all the APIs, and then we will focus on the front end only. So we will create the next application and we will call all the APIs from the backend that we have created using the Spring Boot. So let's go and build the application. So now let me go to the Spring Initializer. I'll just go to the browser and let me go to the start.spring.io and let me create the Spring Boot project. I'll give the group ID as com.dailycodebuffer. Artifact ID I'll give as user management system. Package name as user system. Packaging as jar, Java version as 11, and let me add the dependencies. I'll add the Spring Web dependency. I'll add the JPA dependency, MySQL dependency. Okay, with JPA and MySQL, I'll be able to connect to the database. Spring Web will help me to create the APIs. So that's it. Let me just generate the project and open in IntelliJ IDEA. Let me open the IntelliJ IDEA. And let me open the project. I'll go to the documents, Java workspace, and user management system. Let's open it. Okay, it is resolving the dependencies, so we'll wait for a second to complete. Okay, it's completed. Importing the Maven project now. Now let's create the different packages that we'll need. I'll go to the src folder, main Java. This is our package. Let's create the different package. We'll create the controller package for creating our controllers. Entity to create our entities. To create the service package. Repository package to create our repositories. We'll create the model package to create our models that will interact with the UI. Okay, and bunch of other packages also you can implement based on the different scenarios. Like for exception, you can create the exception package. For utilities, you can create the util packages, and you can create all the classes in those particular packages as per requirement. For now, let's only add these particular things. Now we need to connect our application to our database as well. So let's add the database dependencies, database configurations actually in our application.properties file, and we need to create the schema as well. So let me just copy paste the details over here quickly, because those details would be configuration only. You need to update it once. Okay, I'm adding the Spring Data Source URL, and let me add the other details as well. So you can see that these are the details I have added over here. That is the data source URL, username, password of my database, the driver class name that I'm using, that is the MySQL driver, and I have added the JPA Hibernate DDL auto equals to update. So whenever there is an update in our entities, those will be reflected in our database. And I have also added the Spring JPA shows equal to true. So all the queries will be printed in the console. Now we need to create a schema. So as I'm using the MySQL, I'll go to the MySQL workbench and I'll create one schema. So this is my database. Let me just create one schema. Create a schema, and I'll just say this as a user app. User underscore app. Okay. And I'll create the schema. I'll apply the changes. Done successfully. And if I refresh it, you can see that user app is created. Now if I go back to my application, this is where in the URL I need to provide the schema as well. So here I have provided that Spring data source URL equals to JDBC MySQL localhost :3306. That's where my application, my database server is running, and user app is my schema, and all this bunch of other informations are username, password, and everything. Let's create the entity first. Okay, what we are going to store. So we are going to store the user. So let me just create a Java class that says user entity, and to make this as an entity we need to annotate it with entity, and I'll also annotate with @table annotation to give a particular name to a table. So I'll just define name equals to users, and I will add the different properties. I'll just add private long ID, private long it should be, and I'll add private string first name, private string last name, private string email ID. Now, so let me just create the getAsSetters and constructor. I'll create the getAsSetters for all the fields. Now you can use the Lombok also to create all the boilerplate code, but I realize that some of you might not be using Lombok, so I am creating this tutorial without using Lombok, using the conventional way. So let me create the constructor as well. So I'll create the constructor, default constructor, and I'll also create the constructor with all the fields as well. And as this is an entity, we need to annotate with @ID for our primary key, and we need to also define how this primary key will be generated. So I'm defining generated value, and what is the strategy for it? That is the generation type.identity. So this particular ID will be auto generated. All these particular fields we are going to pass from our APIs. So my entity is created. Now with this entity we need to create the repository as well, from which we are going to get the data from our database. So let me create the repository. I'll create a Java class that would be interface, and I'll just define as user repository. This user repository will extends JPA repository, and this JPA repository is of type user entity, and the ID type is long. So you just have to define this, and you need to annotate with @repository. So your repository is ready, your entity is ready. Now along with your entity you need to create the model as well that will interact with your UI. So let me just create the model as well. I'll create the model as user class, and what you have to do is whatever the entities or whatever the fields that you have defined in your entity, just copy those things and add in your model. And for this also I'll just create the constructor with no arguments, constructor with all the fields, and getAsSetters for all the things. That's it, everything is created now. You can see that there is a lot of code that we are doing as a boilerplate. So Lombok helps to reduce all those codes. Now we need to define our controller and our services. So let me just create one controller, that is the user controller. Now you might be thinking that we are going very fast, but trust me, it's very simple. This is the simplest thing that we can do in our tutorial. But if you still think that this is very fast, then you can check out the Spring Boot tutorial course where we have done all these things in slower pace and in depth, so you can understand each and everything that we are doing very easily. We are not doing anything complex here, we are just creating the different APIs. And as we are using Java, we need to create a lot of files and a lot of boilerplate code, okay? So as this is a user controller, we need to annotate with REST controller to create this as a REST controller. And in this we are going to create the different methods, and as this is a REST controller we will also do request mapping, like what all the requests should be mapped. So let me just do that also. I'll do /API/v1/. So anything coming as /API/v1 will come over here, okay? And in this particular controller I need the service as well. So let me go ahead and create the service. So in the service package, let me create the user service, and this will be the interface. Now we need to add the implementation for that as well. So let me create the user service implementation that will implement user service, and this is a service, so we'll annotate with @service. Cool, right? Now let's go to the controller and we need to inject this. So I'll just define private user service and I'll annotate with AutoWire. Okay, it is telling me that create the constructor instead, and okay, let's do that. Create the constructor. Now let's create the different methods. First method we are going to create is to store the entire user itself. So I'll just create a method public user save user, and we'll import this from the user system.model, and it will take the same user, and this is your request body. So I need to annotate with request body, and we need to annotate this method as post mapping, and what would be the URL? That would be /user, and we need to call the user service as well. So we'll just define user service dot, I'll create the same method, that is the save user, and I'll pass the user object over here. And this particular save user is not available, it's not created in the user service, so we need to create it. So let's go ahead and create this. So create method save user in the user service. So we have created the method, and now we need to implement this method as well. So you can see that it's showing the one related problem. So let's go to the user service IMPL, and here we need to implement. So let's implement the method that is the save user. So now from this user service IMPL, we need to have the object of the repository as well, because from this service we need to call our database, we need to call our repository. So for that, let's create the object for it. I'll just say private user repository, and let me add the constructor parameter. Now this is the user. What I need is user entity. So here I'll just define user entity equals to new user entity, and using the bean utils dot copy properties, I'll copy the properties from the user object to the user entity object. Okay, and once this is done, I'll simply do user repository dot save user. What is the user? That is the user entity. Okay, once this is done, I need to send back the user. That's it, your first API is ready. Okay, to save the data to the database, that is the user. Now let's go and create the another one. Let's create the method to get all the users. So again, we'll go to the user controller. Let's create one more method, public list of user, because we need the list of users that are saved in the database. Okay, and I'll just mention that get all users. This is a list. I'll import the list from the java.util package. I'll annotate with get mapping, and I'll define this as a users. Am I doing anything wrong over here? Yes, because I'm doing in the service IMPL. I don't want to do here. Let me just cut from here, and let's go to the user controller. And here I need to do, I'll make these users so everything is correct. Now I need to get all the users that are stored in the database. So I'll just do return user service dot get all users. I'm not taking any input parameter over here because I need all the users. This get all users we need to create method. Okay, so let's create this in the user service. Let's go to the user service. And let's implement the method. And here what we will do, here we need to get the list of user entity, because we are going to get the user entity from the database, and that list of user entity we need to convert to the list of user. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. User entities equals to user repository dot find all. Okay, this will give me the entire list of user entity which are saved in the database. Now I want to convert this list of user entity to the list of users to send back to the controller, and that will again send back as a response to the client. So for this, let me create the object of list of users equals to, I'll stream through this particular user entity and I'll convert to the user object. So let me do that. That is the user entities dot stream, and I will map it. I'll get the user object, and okay, I'll get the user entity for sure, and I need to map this to the new user. So here I need to define user entity dot get id, user entity dot get first name, user entity dot get last name, user entity dot get email id, and dot collect collectors dot to list, because we need to collect everything and to convert to the list from the stream. So you can see that it's pretty easy, pretty simple. We are just converting the user entities, list of user entities, to the list of users. That's it, nothing else. And we need to return back that users. Cool, right? You can see that another method is done. Now let's go ahead and create the method to get a particular user based on the ID that we provide. Okay, currently you can see that we are getting all the users, but now let's do based on the ID that we are going to pass. So I'll create one method, that is public get user by ID, and the return type would be response entity, and this response entity is of type user. And now this would be your get mapping. It would be slash users and slash you need to pass some ID. So I need to get that as a path variable. And now here let me define that path variable. This path variable is long. It's of ID, and I need to define the path variable as well. That path variable is nothing but the ID. Okay, whatever the value that you provide here. So here you can see that we are taking the path variable for the users slash path variable, that is the ID. Now based on this ID, we are going to fetch the details from the database and we are going to pass back to the client, because client will give, okay, I need a user with ID 1, I need user with ID 2, whatever. Now let's create the object, that is the user equals to null, and user equals to user service dot, I'll create this method as well, get user by user ID, and here I need to pass the ID, because based on this ID I need to get the data. And this method I need to create, so let me just create this method, create method get user by ID in user service. Yes, I want to create. Let me solve this problem because I need to implement this method. Okay, done. Now here what I have to do is I need to have the user entity object, user entity equals to user repository dot find by ID. What is the ID? this one. Now this will return the optional of user, but I need to get a particular user from it, so I just will do get. Okay, now I need to convert user entity to user, so I'll just define user equals to new user, and I'll just do bean utils dot copy properties. I need to copy properties from user entity to user, so I'll just define that way, that source is user entity and target is user, and I need to return back user. That's it, that's done. Let's go to the controller, and here we need to return response entity dot OK, and we need to pass the body is my user, and to remove new. Okay, cool. So you can see that this particular method is also ready. You can see that how quick we can create all these methods in Spring Boot. Now we got the data based on the ID as well. Now let's delete that as well. Let's create the API to delete the data based on the ID that has been provided. Now, so for that, let me create a method, public, and again I'll create response entity, and this response entity I'll create a map. This map is of type string and boolean, and I'll just define delete employee, and this is a delete mapping at the rate delete mapping. And here in this delete mapping we need to define the same thing. What is the API? That is /user / path variable, that is the ID. Now let's define the path variable as an input parameter, that is the long ID, and your path variable annotation at the rate path variable, which is of type ID. Cool, right? You can see that a lot of things are done now. Now we need to delete this, so let me just do boolean deleted equals to false first, then deleted equals to user service dot delete user, and in this delete user I'll pass the ID. Okay, this delete user is not there yet in the user service, so we need to create it. That will return the boolean true or false. So let me just create the method, that is the delete user in user service. Created. Let's implement this method in the user service IMPL. Implement the method. Yes. And here I'll just do user entity user equals to user repository dot find by ID, and to pass the ID dot get. We got the ID, we got the user based on the ID. Now user repository dot delete user, and we need to return true. That's it, right? Now yeah, you can do bunch of validations and everything, but I'm just simplifying things over here just to make you understand how the application entirely works together, your front end, back end, all the logins and everything. Now let's go back to the controller. We need to implement the controller yet for this. So what I'll do, I got it's deleted or not, then I need to create a map which is of type string and boolean, and this is a response equals to new hash map response dot put. I'll just put that this is deleted as true, and I'll just return response entity dot OK response. Oops, you can see that done. Your delete method is also done. We just did a simple thing over here. We took the path variable ID, which particular ID we need to delete. We took that ID and pass that ID to the user service, that delete user method that we created. If that ID is available, if that user entity is available in the database, delete it. Create a map that says deleted as true and return back. You can directly return true and false as well. And you can also customize the response as well. Whatever you want to do, you can do. It's very easy. Okay, now let's create a method to update the data, that is the put mapping. So this particular method will take two things. It will also take the ID, plus it will also take the entire object that we want to save against that particular ID. Suppose for me, I have created my user, that is Shabbir Dawoodi, with particular email, and for me the ID is 1. If I want to update that, I will pass the ID 1, update ID 1 with this particular new object. So that's what we are going to do. So let me just create a method that is public response entity. This response entity is of type user, and update user, and I'll annotate with put mapping, and this will be slash users slash ID, that is the path variable. Now we need to define over here, that is the @path variable ID, long ID, and we need to get the request body as well. So I'll just define the request body also, that is the user. Okay, two things we are injecting. Now we can do is user equals to user service dot update user, which will pass ID and user both, and which will return response entity dot OK user. Okay, this is ready. Now we need to create this update user method. Let's create this method. Okay, method is created in the user service. Let's implement in the user service IMPL as well. Implement the method. Okay, so here what I'll do, I'll create the user entity object first, equals to user repository dot find by ID. I'll pass the ID dot get. Simple, we got the user from the database. Now we need to update it, so I'll just do user entity dot set email user dot get email. Whatever the email we got from the user object, I'm just updating back in the user entity. Same way I'll do for the user entity dot first name. Sorry, I need to do set first name. Okay, set first name and user dot get first name, user entity dot set last name, and user dot get last name. Okay, so all the fields are set except the ID, because ID we have to make sure that it's same. Then we need to again save, so we'll just do user entity dot, not user entity, user repository dot save user entity. Okay, and we need to return back the user. So that's it. You can see that all the things are done. Your controller is also done. Okay, so now let's start the application and let's see what is happening. So let me just go to the user management system application. Let's start the application. You can see the application is started. You can see the table is also created. Okay, if you go to the MySQL, let me just refresh it. In the user app, if you go in the tables, your user table is created. Okay, and you can see that currently there is no data, but what we can do is we can use the Postman to create all this data. So let me just show you that. Okay, let me just create the new request, and I'll just define http :// local host : 8080 slash API slash v1 slash users. I hope the API is correct. Let me just re-verify it. Okay, slash API slash v1 slash users. We will do the post request. So let me just change to post. Let me go to the body, raw, JSON. Let me copy this fields. And if I go to the user, I need first name, last name, and email. Okay, and let me just give the details. Shabir Daudi Shabir at gmail.com. That's it. Let me hit on send. My data should be saved. And you can see that my data is saved. I got 200 okay. I got the response back as well. And the ID generated is 0. So we'll see what happened on that if I post again. But in the backend, we should be seeing those things. If I go back, if I execute this query again, you can see that I am seeing 2 records over here. Okay, so that's all good. I'm able to store the data as well. Now if I change back to the get, and if I do users, I should be getting both the users. You can see that I'm getting both the users, that is users, user 1 and user 2. And if I pass /1, I should be getting a particular user. Cool, right? And if I do delete for user 2, I should be able to delete that user as well. You can see that deleted true. And if I do /users and do get, I should be only getting 1 record. So yeah, you can see that my entire API is working completely fine. Now we need to implement the UI with the help of Next.js. So now let's implement the UI application. Now, as I have already told you that Next.js is the framework on top of the React.js. So we have to create the next step. Instead of using the npx create react app, we'll be using the create next step. So let's go to the terminal and let's create the project. So let me go to the terminal. Let me just minimize my IntelliJ IDEA. And here I'll go to the folder structure. Okay, and here I'll create the app, that is the npx create next app, and then you need to give your name of the app. So I'll just give the name of the app as user management UI. And here you can see that your app is creating just the way that it was creating for the React.js. Okay, here you can see that all the informations are there. If you want to run this app, you can run by this command, that is npm run dev. You can also use yarn as well. Now let's go to this particular folder, that is the cd user management UI, and let's open this folder in the editor, that is a VS Code. So here this is our app. Let me just open the terminal here as well, and I'll just run this, that is npm run dev. And here you can see that my application is started on port 3000. So let me just go to the browser, and if I go to localhost 3000, here you can see that this is your default Next.js application. You can go to the examples, how to deploy it, and learn about the Next.js as well. All the informations are here. From here only you can directly traverse, but we don't need all this information. So we need to remove all this particular data and we need to build our app. So let's go to the VS Code and let's remove what is not necessary. So before that, let me just show you the folder structure as well. So here you can see that this would be your folder structure. You have pages folder, public, styles, and all the other information. You can see that you have next.config.js, you have package.json, and if you go to package.json, you can see that all the dependencies, Next.js dependency, React dependency, React DOM dependency is there, and ESLint dependency for your development purposes. Now if you go to the styles folder, you can see your global style sheets, and if you go to the public folder, all your public assets would be here. And if you go to the pages folder, inside this pages folder, you can see your index.js file, and this index.js file is the starting point for your application. All the information that you can see will be coming from here. And in the underscore app.js, this is the component that has been defined. Now if you see, there is a API folder as well. So in this API folder, you can see there are a bunch of there is an API created, that is the hello API. So Next.js comes with the default configuration, default implementation for the API route as well. So if you want to create any APIs, you can directly create the APIs. You don't have to add any dependencies for your REST APIs. So what we'll do, we'll just remove the stuffs which is not needed. Okay, I don't need the home.module or CSS, so I'll just remove this. Okay, and from the global.css, I don't need any style sheet, so I'll just remove all the things from here as well. And if I go to the index.js, I don't need the meta information or link for the favicon, so I'll just remove that as well. And from the main section, I don't need all this information, so let me just remove that as well. And I don't need footer as well. Okay, and I'll remove this imports as well. And here you can see that the head tag is there. So whenever you want to add any header information using the Next.js head tag, you can add any information. So here we can add user management app, and I'll just remove this style sheet from the main as well. I don't need those information. Now you can see that everything is clear. If I go back, you can see that there is a still styles.container in the class name. So let me just remove that as well. If I go to the index.js, I don't need this information as well because we just removed the style sheet. Okay. So here you can see that we have a blank slate. Now from here we will be creating our application. Alongside Next.js, we are also using the Tailwind CSS to build our application. Tailwind is really simple to use and it's very powerful. So let's go ahead and integrate the Tailwind CSS. So if you just go to Tailwind CSS and go to the installation and go to the framework guides. So we are using Next.js, so we'll go to the Next.js, and as we have already created the project, we'll go here, we'll copy these commands, and let's go to the terminal again, and let me just create the new terminal, and let me just use this command to add the Tailwind CSS. So you can see that once this is done, your Tailwind CSS is added. If you go to the package.json, you can see that Tailwind CSS is added, post CSS is added, and auto prefixer is added, and alongside your tailwind.config.js is also added. Now we need to do the configuration for Tailwind over here. So let's go, and you can see that this is the configuration that you have to add. So let me just copy this detail and let's add over here. And we also need to add these directives to our global CSS. So let's go to the global CSS and let's add this. Make sure you save all the files, because in the past I have made a mistake, like I did not save the file and nothing was working, and I was constantly wasting around 30 minutes of time to figure it out what was the issue. So make sure that whatever the configuration that you have added, you save the files and then you restart your server. So all the configurations are added. Now if I restart my server, let me go to this Control C to close the server, stop the server, and let me just start the server again. Now my Tailwind CSS is installed. Now let's go ahead and create the application. Now the same way that you know React.js, we can create the different components and everything. It's everything similar. Okay, now before we go and start our application, I'll just show you what are the plugins that I have installed. So make sure that you have installed your plugins, so it will be easier for you to develop the application. So go to the extension, and I have installed this particular plugin, that is the ES7 Plus React Redux React Native Snippet. So please install this so you will be able to easily create the components. So use this particular plugin, and also use the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. So it will make sure that all the utility classes are there. You will be able to easily use those. IntelliSense will tell you what are the classes available, so you don't have to type everything. So these are the major plugins that you should be downloading, you should be installing it. But the other plugins also you can install, like the Prettier to format the code and all the other bunch of stuffs. I have already created a video on that, so you can check that video as well. So with this being said, let's create our first component, that is the navigation bar, and let's start with it. So let me just close everything. I'll go to the files, and here before the main section, here I need to create the navigation bar. So I'll just say I just need to create nav bar, and let me just copy this and let me create the navigation bar. So what I'll do, I'll just create a folder that says components, and inside this components folder we will be creating all the different components. So here you can see that there is a pages folder as well. So whenever you want to create any static files or any static components, all those things you can create in the pages folder. And in the APIs, as I told you earlier, to create all your APIs. So we'll see that as well when we are using the next authentication. So inside this components folder, let's create one file, that is navbar.js, and you will use the snippet to create the component, that is the RAFCE, that is the snippet coming from the ES7 plus React Redux React Native tool. So let me just rename the file navbar.js. Okay, and if I do RAFCE, you can see that the component is created instantly, right? Now as you are using the Next.js, if you want, you can just remove this import as well, it will still work. And if you go to the index.js, you need to import this component. So let me just import the component. Okay, and if you go to the browser, you will be able to see the component. You can see that the nav bar is coming. Now let's go ahead and start building this component. So inside this nav bar, we'll go and we'll create the component. So you can see that this is just a function which is returning the JSX. Okay, this is just a JSX, which is a combination of JavaScript and HTML. We can directly build everything. So here what I'll do, inside this div, I'll create one more div, and here we will define the class name, and here we will define all the class name as from the Tailwind utilities. So let me just add the background color BG gray. You can see that all the classes are coming. I'll just define the gray color, and for this div, let me just define the height and width. I'll define height of 16, and padding in X direction is 8. I'll just define, and everything is flex, and all the items should be in the center. Okay, and inside this div, I'm defining a paragraph, and this paragraph says user management system. And for this paragraph also, I can define the styles. I'll just define class name equals to, I'll just define text as white, and I'll just do font as bold and flex as auto. Let's see that. You can see that the nav bar is created. You can see that with such a simple steps, with only few of the classes, you can see that we were able to create a navigation bar easily. Now let's create a component to list down all the users that we have already saved in the database. Okay, from the Postman we had saved couple of users. So let's create a component, let's create a table which will show all the users, and it will also give the ability to edit and delete those users. So let's just create the table here. So for that we will create one component, that is a user list. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside this component, let's create one more component that says userlist.js, and we'll do RFC, so everything is generated. Now here we need to create the table. So what we'll do, we'll first create the table. So inside this div, let me just create one more div, and inside this div we'll create a table. Now for this div, we'll just define class name equals to container, margin as auto, and vertical margin as 8. And for this we will just define, this is a flex, and we'll just define shadow, and we'll just define border bottom only for this. Now within this table I can define class name and the background for this table. I'll just define border background gray 50, and inside this table let me just create the table head, and this table head will have a row, and this row will have a th tags. So let me just create a th tag as well. So this th head also will have a class name. This class name, let me just define this over here, because only header I want of this color, and this entire table I just need the minimum width of full. Currently you cannot see anything, but let's add the header so you can see. So I'll just define first name, and this particular user list we need to add in the index.js as well. So if you go to the index.js, inside this main, let me just add the user list for now. After that we will add to the appropriate position where we want to add. Okay, currently just to display I'm just adding over here, and let me just import that as well. Okay, the component is imported, and if I go back you can see that I'm just able to see the header part and where we have defined the first name. So let's add the different columns as well and style it out. Okay, so let me just define first everything. I need a first name, I need last name, I need email ID, and I need actions. So first name, last name, email ID, and the actions. Actions is just edit or delete, whatever. Okay, all the things are laid out, but we need to have the style sheet as well, like to have this capital and to be left aligned and this action to be right aligned. So let's do that. So for this table header, let's define the class name. We'll just say text to left, font medium, text as gray, 500, everything is uppercase, tracking as wide, so that all the letters are separated out. And I'll just define the padding in both the directions. So you can see that it is looking quite good now, right? So let's add the same thing to the others as well. So I'll just copy this, paste it here, and here as well. The only thing I'll just change is text right. So you can see that your header is done. Now let's go ahead and create the body as well. So after table head we need to have the t body, and inside this t body we need to have the table row and table data. Okay, for this t body we will define the class name as bg white, and for this td, let me just define the class names. I need text as left, padding in x direction x6, padding in y direction is 4, and white space no wrap, I don't want to wrap it. And inside this td, let me just create a div, and inside this div let me just define Shabir, and this div should have class name, and I will give text as small, text gray as 500. Okay, let's see how it is looking. You can see that it's looking quite good, right? So let's add the same thing for the other as well. So this td, I'll just copy this. This is for the last name, this is for the email ID, and the next one for the actions. So let me just define Shabir Dawoodi, shabir@gmail.com. You can see that it is looking quite good. Now for the actions, we need to have the anchor tags. So let's define that. So instead of this div, I'll define the anchor tag href equals to hash for now. After that we will add as well. Then class name, I'll just define text indigo 600, and when we hover over, we'll just change the text indigo to 800, and when we hover over, it should be cursor pointer. Okay, and we will give the name as edit. So you can see that it's looking quite good. Now let's add for the delete as well. This anchor tag, this is delete. Okay, and for this I need to have a text right. Okay, and I need to have the padding as well. So let me just give the padding over here, that is px of 4. So you can see that there's a padding, and now this particular row looks good. So what we have to do now is we have to fetch the data from the database, and we need to loop this particular row, and we need to show all the data. So let's go ahead and do that. Before that, you can see as this entire header section, right, body section, sorry, this entire body section we have to loop through. So for this particular piece of code, we can create a component and we can loop through that particular component. So let's go ahead and do that. What we can do, we can create one component that says it's a user component. So I'll just define user.js, and let's create the component with rafce, and here we can define everything. So what I'll do, from this tr tag to this tr tag, I'll just cut from here. I'll go to user.js and I'll paste everything here. And in this user list, here inside t body, I can call that user. You can see that it still looks same. Okay, now we need to call the API, backend API, to fetch all the data. So let's do that. We'll go to the top here, and here let's define the API which we want to call. So I'll just define constant user base URL, that we define user API base URL. That makes more sense, right? Equals to HTTP localhost. This is not the one. Let me just change. It should be 8080/API/v1/users. Okay, if you go back to our IntelliJ IDEA, if you go to the user controller, localhost 8080/API/v1/users. So this is our API. So that's what we have defined here. So now we have to use the state to define the state, whatever the data that we are going to fetch, and we will define the hooks to fetch the data and to save the data in the state. So what we will do, I'll use the use state snippet to create the state, and I'll just define users, and by default it is null. And I'll also define use state snippet for loading, and by default that is also true. Okay, and let me just import the use state as well. So let me just import here use state. Now we need to use the use effect hook to fetch the data. So let's create that. I'll just define use effect. So once you do that, you can see that using the snippet everything is created. Use effect, I'll just import. And here what I need to do is I need to fetch the data. So let me just first remove this. I don't have any dependency now, so let me just remove that as well. And here I'll just define constant of fetch data equals to, this would be an asynchronous function, and I'll just define set loading to true. And inside try catch, I'll define my response, constant response equals to await fetch. Okay, I want to fetch the data from the base API that we have defined. Now let me add the configuration for this also. The method would be get and headers content type equals to application slash JSON. So you can see that we have defined the fetch API as well, that get the data from this particular API URL. The method type is get, content type is JSON. Okay, once we get that, we'll get the users equals to await response.json. And once we get the users, we will set the users to our state. And inside this catch, we'll just define console.log the errors. And after that, we'll just define set loading to false because the loading is completed. And this particular function is defined. So we can call this function here, that is the fetch data. Cool, right? So till here we would be able to get the data from this method. When this particular component loads, okay, this particular hook will be called. This hook has this particular method and it will call this method. Now what we have to do is whatever the data that we got, we have to pass those data to the user component as well. So if you go over here, that is the body section. So we need to define that if it's not loading and so once loading is completed, then only we have to show this. That's what we have defined. Now within this user component, we have to pass the user as well. So whatever the data that we got, all the users, we have to loop through this and we need to call this component, that is a user. So inside this T body, what I'll do, I'll just define users.map of user, and this will call the user component. And this particular user component, we need to pass this user object. So how we will pass? We will pass using the props. So we can define whatever the key I want to use in this user.js. So in the user.js also I want to use this user, and as a prop I can define this user. Okay, so I'm passing this user, I'm mapping this user to pass through this user component. Simple. And we also need the key. So I'll just define key equals to user.id. Because every component should have a key. This key would be unique. So whatever the primary key that you are using, you can just set there for the key and it should be good. Now in this user component, we need to take that prop as well. So as an input argument over here, we will define that user, and this row as well, we need to define key to make it unique. So I'll just define user.id. Simple. Now all the static data that we have defined, we need to change it to use user dot first name. Let me just copy this information I'll paste here, I'll paste here. Okay, this will be last name and this would be email ID. Simple, right? So let's go back. So you can see that there is some error. Okay, cannot read the properties. So let's go and fix this. So what we will do, we'll go to the user list and we will add the null check. So if there is a users, then only go for checking the map. So now you can see that I don't have any data. So let's check that as well. So if we go to the MySQL, let's connect. And I have one data, so we should be getting this record. Okay, so let's see what is the error. Okay, you can see that there is an error for the CORS policy. So CORS policy from the backend is not working. So we need to add the URL in the backend to allow this URL. And you can see that constantly it is trying to reconnect. So we need to fix that as well, because this use effect is trying to recall every time. So we need to fix that. So let's go ahead and fix that. So what we have to do is we need to give the dependency. So in this user list, in this fetch data, we need to give the blank dependency this way. So it will only call once. And if you go to the backend, if you go to the controller, we need to add the policy, that is CORS origin, cross origin, and inside value we need to define HTTP colon localhost colon 3000. Okay, so we are allowing this particular API to call the services. HTTP localhost 3000. Let's restart this. And if we go back, so here you can see that we are getting the data. So our first component is ready, right? Cool. Edit and delete function are still not working. We will add that, but let's before that add the functionality to add a user. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go back to the VS Code and let's go ahead and do that. So what I'll do, I'll create one more component that says add user.js, and here in this particular component we will define one button, and when click on that button a pop-up will appear to save the data. So inside this I'll just define div class name equals to height of 12 and above class name equals to, this should be the container, MX auto to make sure that's in the center, and margin as well. And inside this div I'll just define button, and this button says add user, and let's define the style also. Class name equals to rounded BG slat 600, text should be white, px6 py2, make sure that we have proper padding, and font is semi bold. Okay, and we are adding this component in the index.js before user list for now. Okay, you can see that we got the button. Cool, right? Now we need to create the model. So let's go ahead and create the model. Now the model that I'm going to create is using the headless UI. So if you go here, if you check Tailwind CSS headless UI, okay, this is the headless UI and all these components are there. So what we are going to do is we are going to add as a dependency, and we are going to use this dialog model. So let's go to the GitHub and let's add this dependency. Okay, you can see that dependency is added. If I go to the package.json, the headless UI dependency is added. So now let's go to the add user and let's add the details. So what I'll do, I will add the transition here because I need to have a transition. I need to animate it. Okay, so it will look cool. So I'll add the transition from the headless UI / react, and you can see that instantly it started giving error because in the react it can only have one parent. So what I'll do, I'll just add the fragment. Okay, so now this fragment is your parent components and this div and this transition are inside that. And within this transition we need to add some property. I'll just define up here show equals to is open. So this is a state that we are going to define, and open this as a fragment. So now don't worry about anything like how I know all this stuffs. I have just gone through the documentation. I'll show you how to go through it. So if I go back and if I click here, you can see that this is a particular model that we want. When we click on open dialog, this is something that we want. So what I did, I just went to code and I have just copied all this information and I have make sure that everything looks good. And if you want to start from scratch, just install from here and this is the dialog that you can use. It's very simple. Okay, so you can just copy all the information from here. Everything is nicely placed over here. The documentation is really good, so you will be easily able to follow through. So now let's go back and let's add our detail. So inside this transition I need to add the dialog, and this dialog as div, and I'll just need to define the class name as well. It is fixed inside 0 z index 10 overflow in y direction as auto. On close, what is the method that we want to call on close? That is the close model. We are going to define this method. Okay, so don't worry. And inside this dialog we can create a div. So for this div we will define class name equals to minimum height of screen. I'll just give some padding and all the text should be in the center. And this div will have again a transition for child elements. So transition dot child, and this particular transition dot child will have bunch of properties. So let me just copy all this property and explain you. This just for the transition. Okay, it's very simple. You can directly copy from the documentation that I have shown you. Okay, like this particular transition is as fragment, the way it was defined over here, and all the bunch of other properties, how it should appear, how the animation should be. So within this transition element we need to define our UI. So let me just define the div, and this div will have class name equals to inline block, width of full, max width of MD, padding of 6, margin of 8, in the y direction overflow is hidden so there is no scroll bars, text should be left aligned, content should be aligned in middle, transition all, it should transform, background should be white, shadow as Excel, and rounded. You can see that there are a bunch of properties, and you can see that we are just trying to create everything using the utility class of Tailwind CSS. So that is the power of Tailwind CSS. You don't have to remember everything. All the utility classes are there. You just go through it, and once you create one application, it would be very easy for you to create another application, because styling is very easy in Tailwind CSS. I was not good at CSS before, but with Tailwind CSS, I'm just loving to create the UI. So let me just go inside this div and let me just create a title. So dialog.title, and this title I'll just define add new user. So once this is complete, you will see the what we are creating. Okay, don't worry. As h3 class name equals to text large. Very good, because we need quotes. Text large. Font should be medium size. Leading 6. Text gray 900. Okay, now let me define one thing before that, so I can show you what we are building. So let me just define the state, because we have defined here that is open is a state. So let's define that state. Use state snippet is open, and by default it is false. And let me import the use state as well, and I'll define couple of methods. Okay, I've just defined two methods, that is close model at that time set the state to false, open model at that time set the state to true. So instead of this, I just need to import from React. Okay, so when I click on this add user, I need to set this to true, okay, to show the model. So let's do that. So on this button, add user, what I'll define on click, open model. Simple, right? This method I'm calling open model, and this particular open model will set the state to true, and when the state is true, the model will appear. So let me just refresh the page, add user, and you can see that we got the model. Now we need to build this model. We need to create the form. Okay, so let's go ahead and build that. So you can see that how easy it is to create UI using the Tailwind CSS and Next.js. So we did till the title. Now after the title, let's create a div again. Let's define class name. This should be flex, max width of MD, and margin auto in the X direction. And inside this div, let's create one more div, and this will have class name, margin in Y direction, and one more div, class name, height 14, and margin Y 4. Now let me create a label, and this label I'll just say is first name, and let me define the properties for class as well. This should be block, text gray 600, text should be small, and font should be normal. And after the label, I need to have the input tag as well. So the input type equals to text, name equals to first name, and class name equals to height of 10, width of 96. I'll just define border, margin, padding. Okay, you can see that we got the first name, last name as well. Similarly, we have to add for others as well. So let me just copy this. This is for first name, last name, email ID. First name, last name, and email ID. Okay, you can see that first name, last name, email ID. Now we need to have the buttons as well. So let's create that. So after this div, let's create another div that says button. So inside this div, let's create the button, and let me just give the property in the class name. Same way, height equals to 14, margin in y direction is 4, and space between the two buttons I'm giving as space x4, and padding top to 4. Now this button says save, but they should have the properties as well. So let me just give the properties for that. I'll just define class name equals to, the button should be rounded little bit. Okay, text should be white, font should be semi bold, background green of 400, and when we hover over, we should change the background color as well. So I'll just define BG green of 700, padding in y direction as 2, and padding in x direction as 6. So my button is little bit bigger. So if I see now, you can see that I can see the button. Okay, but let's make sure that it's correct. This is wrong, right? Padding in x direction is 6. So now button should come correctly. Okay, you can see that hover over is also working, padding and everything is correct. Now we need to have the close button as well. So let's create that. So just copy this button and make this as a close. This should be red. This also should be red. Cool, right? You can see that button is created and my entire model is also created. Now I need to make sure that all the values that I add over here, that is first name, last name, email ID, those values should be bind to one state. So whenever we do any change, all those values are updated and it is bind to one state, and when we want to save all those data, we can directly get and we can save to the database. Cool, right? So let's do that. So we'll go to the top and we'll create one state. And the state will be user, and we need to give the default value for the state as well. So I'll just define a id equals to blank, first name equals to blank, last name equals to blank, and email id also blank. Okay, you can see that I've just defined the state. Now what we have to do is we have to define this state to our input fields as well. So if this is the input field, here I have to define what would be the value. So value would be user dot first name. Okay, and here value would be user dot last name, and here value would be value dot email id. Now you can see that I have bind my input fields to my state. Now I need to have a function, so whenever I do any change, so those values would be updating my state as well. So let's create that. So I need to create one handle change function. So let me just go to the top and create one function. So I'll just define constant handle change. It is taking event, and what it will do is just define constant value equals to event dot target dot value. So whatever the event it is happening in that event object, whatever the target is, and get the value from that particular target. Simple. Now we need to set the user. So set user, and here what we have to do, we have to define event dot target dot name. Okay, so whatever the event dot target dot name is, so we have defined that the name is first name. So event dot target dot name we will get as a first name, and that first name is nothing but this first name ID, your key. So that I want to define name equals to whatever the value that I'm getting over here. Cool, right? So that's what I have defined. Now what I want to do extra is whatever the existing values that I have, I want to keep those values and I want to update these values. So I'll just use the object over here. Okay, I'll just define this way. So all the current values, all the existing values will be added, plus the new values would be updated. You can see it's very simple. You don't have to much worry about it. Okay. Now we need to define this handle function to our input fields. Okay, so if we go here on change, we need to handle the handle change event. Okay, and what it will take event and in the handle change we need to define e. Simple, you can see that on change we have to call the handle change. So this thing we need to call at every place. Cool, right? Now what we have to do is we have the button. So now we need to call the save function. So if I go here on the button, I can define one on click function and I can say save user. And for this I can define reset. Cool, right? We have defined two functions for close and save user. Now we need to handle these two functions. We need to create these two functions. So let me just go top and let's create these two functions. So let's define constant save user equals to async function because we are going to call the API. And first thing we have to do is we have to do e dot prevent default. Okay, so we don't want to refresh the page. So now here we need to call this save API. So whatever the API that we have created, right? If you go here, this was the post mapping to save the user. So this API we have to call with the post request and we need to pass the entire user object. So here we have to do that. So I'll just define constant response equals to await fetch API, and inside this fetch API I'll just pass the URL. So this URL I need to get from user list. So this is the one. Now what you can do is, if this is common, you can create one JavaScript file and you can add this particular URL there and you can export it so you can directly use it. Okay, that's also we can do. So let me just add in the add user. Okay, so this is the user API base URL I have provided and I need to add the configuration extra object. So here I can define method is post and the headers I can define content type as application JSON and body I can define JSON.stringify user. So whatever the user state is created, that I'm passing as a body. Now if response is not okay, then throw new error, something went wrong. Okay, otherwise what I'm doing is constant underscore user, whatever the user it is, I'm getting that user, I'm doing await response.json. That's it. Okay, I'm getting the response, I save the data. So now let me create the reset method as well. So I'll just define constant reset equals to this, which will take event as an input, e.prevent default, and our save user method also will take the same. And what we will do, we'll just define set user id equals to null, first name equals to null, last name equals to blank, blank or null, okay, and email id also blank. Okay, so when we reset, we are just clearing all the values, and after that I'm just defining set is open to false because I want to close the model. Okay, and once I get the user back, I'm just calling the reset from here as well. Okay, so it will clear the user data and it will close the model. Cool, right? So let's go ahead and see that. Let me just refresh the page. Let me just open the add user model, and if I click on close, you can see that it's closing. If I click on add user again, if I add detail QQ, and there is some error, so let's solve that. So my this label first name correct, value is correct, handle change, last name handle change, email id handle change. Is my email id correct? Seems like everything is correct. Okay, here it is. Okay, and here also same. Okay, so this was a mistake. Now let's go back to the browser, refresh it, add user, QQ, all the things are there. Let's save, and you can see that data is saved. Now nothing happened in the UI because we have not handled to refresh the state as well. But if you go to the database and if we refresh, we should be able to see the record, right? You can see that we are seeing the record. Now add user is done, but what we have to do is we have to refresh this as well. So once we save the data, okay, so let's go ahead and handle that. So if I go back to the add user, okay, once we save the data, right, once we save the data, we need to update the state of the user list as well. So what we will do is, instead of calling user list from the index.js, right, what we will do, we will call the user list, we will add the user list inside the add user, so we can directly pass the state. Now this is a limitation of props drilling, because what we are going to do is we are going to pass a state as a props to the user list. Now to overcome this type of scenarios, we can use the state management tools like Redux, Context API, and all those stuffs. So if you want those videos, then do let me know in the comment section below. I'll create the videos on that as well. But for now, what I'll do, I'll just remove this user list from here and I'll add in the add user. So once the transition is done, here I'll just define user list, and what I want to do is I want to pass the prop. So I need to have one state as well to handle that particular user. So whenever there is a new update in the user, so let me just handle that way. So here I'm creating one more state, use state snippet, and here I'll just define response user, and this will be the same. Okay, now what I'll do, when I do save user, right, so whatever the record that I'm getting back as a response, I'll set response user, sorry, as this one underscore user. Okay, so my state is updated. Now this state I will pass as a props to the user list. So if I scroll down in the user list, I'll pass this as a user equals to response user. So in the user list, I can take this as a props. So if I go to the user list, I can take this as a prop user, Now what I'll do, I will use this as a dependency to load my data. So if I go here, this is the use effect that is getting all the data. So here I'll define that as a dependency. So whenever there is an update in the user, that particular field will be updated. So if I go back, so here you can see that I'm getting the data. But if I go back to add user, if I add more data, that is HHH, 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 and if I save, you can see that it instantly got the data and it reflected here because we had given the dependency, and based on the dependency, use effect was called, invoked, and it fetch all the data. Cool, right? Now we need to handle the delete and edit functionality. So let's first go ahead and implement the delete functionality. So I'll go back to the user list.js, and in the user list there is a user as well. So let me go there, and here we have edit and delete buttons. So here we need to have an event handler, but what we have to do is, inside this user list there is a child component, that is user, and inside the child component we have these two buttons, that is edit and delete. So when I delete this, I want to change the state of the parent component as well, right? Because I want to delete that particular entry from the parent, that is the user list. So what I have to do is I have to propagate the props from the child to parent. Okay, so that's what we are going to do, because whatever the method that I'm going to create, if that particular method, if I'm creating in the child component, I will not be able to propagate that state to the parent component. So that particular method I have to declare in the parent component, and I have to pass that as a prop, and from the child I can call that method. Sounds complicated, sounds simple, whatever. Let's try to implement. It's really simple. It's very simple. Rather than creating a method in the child component, you are creating a method in the parent component, and you're passing that method to child and telling that, okay, whenever you want to call this method, you can just call this method. Simple. So let's go back. Let's declare the events. So whenever I want to click on delete, I'm just defining on click handler, and so it will take the event and it will pass the ID as well. And I am defining delete user, so that is E and user ID. Okay, so this delete user I'll be getting as the props. Okay, now if I go back to the user list, this user, I'll be getting this delete user. Now I need to create this delete user as well. So let's go ahead and create that. So here I'll just define constant delete user. It's taking two parameters, E and ID. I will just do E dot prevent default, and I'll do the fetch API. And I need to pass the user API base URL +/ ID, because if you go to your API for the delete mapping, you can see that you are passing /users and you are passing the path variable as the ID, which particular user we want to delete. So we are passing that way, that base URL, that is our base URL /ID we want to pass. Now here we'll define what is the method. Method is delete, and then whatever the response would be, if we have users, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the user. So from my backend, that particular record is deleted, and when I get the response back, I want to remove that record from the UI as well. So I want to filter out the data. So I'll just use set users, and what I'll do, I will take the previous element and loop through that, and I'll return previous element dot filter users where user.id is not equals to id. Okay, so what I'm doing, once that record is deleted from the backend, you are filtering out the records that you have currently in the UI. So you are filtering which of the particular user ID it is. Okay, so this user ID that you are passing, that should not exist in the list. You are just removing that and you are passing back the list of user. Sounds simple, right? It's very simple. So if I go back to the browser, let me refresh, and if I click on delete, that particular record should get deleted. And if I check the database as well, I should be able to see only 2 records. Cool. So my delete functionality is also working fine. So my add user is done, my get user is done, and delete is also completed. Now we need to go for the edit user functionality. When we click on edit, we need to open the pop-up model. We need to fetch the existing data available in the database, populate all the fields, and whatever the update you do, you have to save the data back. So if I check my APIs, I have one API available to fetch a particular record. So if I check this get mapping, I can get a particular user based on the ID that I provide. So I have to call this API. I have to give the ID, particular ID, to fetch the records, populate all the fields in the form, and once I click on update, I need to call this put mapping to update the entries in the database. Okay, so we need to call 2 APIs over here. So let's go ahead and implement that. So let's go with the edit functionality now. So if I go to the users, and here what I have to do is the same way what I did for the delete user, I have to do for the edit user as well. So I'll just define on click function over here, e comma id. I need to pass, that will take edit user e comma user id. Okay, and this edit user also will come as a prop. So I'll just define this edit user as well. Now if I go back to the users list, in this user I need to define that edit user equals to edit user, and this particular function that I have to create here, method. Okay, the same way we did for the delete user. So I'm just defining here constant edit user e dot prevent default, and what I want to do is I want to get this particular ID and I want to pass that ID to the component that I'm going to create. So for that, let me just handle one state. So I'll just create one state, use state snippet user ID, and the value I'll pass as null default. And when I get edit user, I'll just update set user ID to ID. Cool, right? Now let's create the edit user component. So let me just create a new component, edit user.js. We'll create the component. Now this edit user will need similar things that we did for the add user. So if I go to the add user, this entire transition it needs. So let me just copy this and let me just add to the edit user. Okay, and it will need all this handle change and all those functions. So let me just copy that as well. So if I go to the add user, it will need this reset. I don't think so. So what I'll do is, I'm sure that it will need close model, open model, handle change. So let me just copy this and add those. Okay, and it will also need this states. So let me just copy this also. Let me just import the state. Cool, right? And let me just import the use effect as well, because we are going to use effect also. So till here all good, right? Now at this point what I want is I want to get the data from the backend for that particular user, for particular ID that I'm going to get. So for that particular user ID I want to call that. So how will get the user ID? I'll get the user ID as a props. So if I go to the users list, here is what something ID that we have defined. So let me just define edit user over here. And let me just wrap around with the fragment. And in this edit user, I can pass user ID. Okay. And this user ID I can take as a prop. And based on this user ID, I can fetch the data. So let's do that. So I need to use the use effect. Okay. Use effect snippet. I don't need all this. And so here you can see that I'm getting the entire method over here, right? As a suggestion. This is coming from GitHub Copilot. You can see that how powerful it is, right? So if I directly use this, I just have to do very minor change, but I don't want to do that. Otherwise you won't be able to learn from here. So in this use effect, I want to use this user ID as a dependency. So let me just give that. And within this use effect, let me call our method. So I'll just define constant fetch data equals to asynchronous method. I'll just implement try catch block. And within this try, let me just define the constant response equals to await fetch. Here I'll just define user base API URL plus / plus user ID. Okay, and the method type would be get. The headers would be content type application JSON. So at this particular point, you have called the fetch data API, get API, whatever for particular user ID it is. We need to get the response here. So constant underscore user equals to await response.json, and we need to set the user. So let me take one of the user, this one, right? So I need to set that. So what I'll do, I'll just say set user underscore user. And I'll just define set is open to true. So once we get the data, my model will open and it will set all the values. Sounds good, right? So let me just add this detail over here, ideally. Okay, and when there is an error, let me just log that error. And I need to call this method if there is a user ID called fetch data. Okay, now let me create the reset as well. So let me just copy from the add user directly. So in the reset, what I need, let me just copy this. And if I go to the edit user, let me just paste that. I don't need this. I don't want to clear the data. I just want to close the model. Okay, and then instead of save user, I need the update user. So I'll just define update user, and I need to have that function. Constant update user equals to asynchronous function. Okay, cool. Now we will implement this function as well. But before that, let's see our data is coming or not. So we need to import this transition as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's import transition from headless UI React. Let's import dialog as well. And we need to import transition.child. Okay. And we need to import fragment as well. Okay, what I'll do, I'll just use the fragment here and I'll just remove this line. So what is the error? You likely forgot to export your component from the file. Okay, if I go here, the component is exported. If I go to the list, okay, cool. So it was just a refresh issue. So you can see that my add user data is coming, everything is coming. If when I click on edit, you can see that my pop is coming and I'm getting the data as well. Let me just update this information as well. So if I go back, instead of add new user, I'll just do update user. Okay, you can see that I'm getting update user. If I close, that's fine, and I'm getting all the information. Okay, now I need to handle this save event. So let's go ahead and do that. So instead of save, what I'll do, I'll just change the name to update. It makes more sense, right? Now let's handle this event, that is the update user. So first thing we will do is e.prevent default, and if I go to the IntelliJ IDEA for the update user, that's a put mapping, and you need to give the ID plus you need to give the request body as well. So two things we need to provide. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll define constant response equals to await fetch data user API base URL / API, and within this we need to pass method equals to put headers equals to content type application JSON, and body equals to JSON.stringify user. Okay, so we have called the method to save the data. Now we need to check for the response. If response is not okay, we can throw new error, something went wrong, else we'll get user object equals to await response.json, and we'll call the reset method as well. Cool, right? This reset function is here, we have already defined, so it will again do the prevent default and it will set the state to false, so my model will be closed. Now one thing that we have to do over here is, if I go to the browser and this particular edit user component, you can see it's a different component. So when I update the record over here, I need to update the state of the user list as well, because from the user list, that is the parent for edit user, we are calling this method. So what we have to do is we have to update the state as well. Okay, so that's what we have to do. So to update the state, we have to get the user back to the parent. So what I'll do, I'll go to the user list and fetching the data use effect. You can see that this use effect, so this use effect, right, to fetch the latest record is dependent on this user state. So I need a way to update this state so that it will again fetch the latest record. So what I'll do, to update this state user, there is a method that is the set users. Okay, but that is used for something else. So what I can do, I can add one more dependency over here. So let me just define one more state. So I'll just define use state and I'll define response user. So whatever the response that you are going to get back, and I'll just define as null, and here I'll define response user as well as a dependency. So whenever there is an update, I'll just define this as a user this way. That makes more sense. Okay, so whenever there is an update in response user or user, it will call the data and it will update the data. So now what I'll do, as an input parameter, as a props, I'll pass the response user method, set response user. Okay, so this method will update the state in the parent component. Okay, that's what we need. So let me take this, let me go to the edit user, and let's take this as a props. Okay, now this method I will use in the update user. Once I get the data, I will use this method to update the state. So the state of the parent is changed, then the model is closed, it will fetch the data and everything should work perfectly fine. So let's go back, let's refresh the page, let's add the user. I'll add the user as ppp. So I'll add the last name as ppp, email also ppp. Now there is no validation currently added, but you can always go ahead and add the validation. I'm just showing you how everything works here. Okay, so if I save, you can see that I'm getting the record. If I click on edit, I'm getting all the records back. Now instead of ppp, I'll just do OOO, and if I update, that particular record should get updated. You can see that this record is updated, and if I want to delete, I can delete this record as well. So all the functionality is working fine. You can see that entire CRUD, create, read, update, delete, everything is working fine, perfectly. Okay, now what we will do is we will add the authentication. Currently you can see that whoever comes to the application, they can access this application, but I don't want that. I want only authenticated user. Okay, so for that, let's implement the next auth.js. So what I will do, if I go to the next auth, okay, this is the next auth.js. Now this is something that we are going to implement, and this is the latest version 4. Okay, and if I go to the npm, this is something that we have to install. So just copy this and go to your VS Code and let's add the dependency. And dependency is added. If I go to the package.json, so now you can see that in the package.json, my next auth dependency is added. Cool, right? Now we are going to implement this login functionality with Facebook. You can add multiple providers as well. Whatever you want, you can add all the providers. And for all of that, you have to create the app in their platform. I will show you for the Facebook for now. Okay, once the dependency is added, for Facebook, you have to go to the Facebook developer. Okay, log into the Facebook and go to the my apps, and here you can create the app. Okay, creating the app is simple. You just have to give the name of the app and the URL. So if you can see that I have already created one app, that is DCB app. Click on create app and you can see that all the different types are getting. So I want the login functionality, right? So you can see that connect consumer products and permission like Facebook login, Instagram basic display to your app. So this is something what I want. So I'll just click on that. I'll click on next. I'll give the name as test and create the app. I just need my password and you can see that your app is created. Okay, now what you have to do is you have to set up the Facebook login. So come here and set it up over here. Okay, once you do that, this is web that you have to do. Okay, so here you have to give the website. So what I will do is I will just give localhost 3000. Okay, this is what you have to do. Save, continue. This is all the information that it is showing how to use everything. Okay, next and done. Okay, now if you come here, if you come to the settings, basic settings, this is the app ID that you need and this is the app secret that you need. If you click on show, you will get the app secret. So this two information that you need, that you have to configure in your application. So we will get these details, and after that I will delete this so you can see those information. You can see how it is working. Now we need to configure our next auth.js. So if you go to next auth.js, if we do get started, it will tell us how exactly that we have to implement the functionality. So you can see we have to add the API route first. So this is the way that we have to add the API route for the dynamic route handling. Okay, because Next.js supports dynamic route handling, so we need to create the JavaScript files according to the route that we have to create. So currently you can see inside pages API auth that we have to create. So if we go to the VS Code, currently we have pages/API. So inside this API we need to create a folder that says auth. Okay, And inside this auth, we need to create this JavaScript file. So let's copy this, and inside this auth folder, let's create the JavaScript file. And now we need to copy this. Let's copy this. Let's paste this. Simple as it is. Okay, it's done. Now currently you can see that it is using GitHub provider, but I want Facebook provider. So I'll just change from GitHub provider to Facebook provider, and for that I need to change the provider as well. That is from Facebook. Okay, the same Facebook provider that I have to define here. Okay, and I need to pass the client ID and secret ID. And so you can see that it's taking from the environment variable. So I'll show you how to handle that in the development as well. But if you're going with production, those particular environment variables you will directly define in the environment itself. So let me just define this as Facebook underscore client underscore ID, and this also Facebook underscore client underscore secret. So you can see that my Facebook provider is set up. Now I need to create the environment file as well. So what I'll do, I need to create one file. Okay, in the root directory, create a file with name .env.local. Okay, and inside this file we have to add our details. So if you go here, Facebook client, that's what I have to define here. Facebook client equals to client ID, Facebook client secret equals to, and you have to define one next auth URL as well. Okay, and this would be your application URL. So whatever the application URL it is, that you have to define. Okay, this is some configuration. Now for Facebook client ID, if you go to the browser, this is your application ID, this is your client ID. So define that over here, and your app secret. So this is your app secret. So copy this, don't share this with anyone. Okay, I'm just sharing this with you because after this I'm just going to delete the application from Facebook. So here you can see that the configuration is done. Now what I have to do is, now I have to, if you go to the getting started page, you can see that everything is given very nicely. Now you can see that what you have to do, you have to go to the underscore app.js, and there you have to define your session provider. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I go to the underscore app.js, here I have to define that. So here what I'll do, I'll just copy this, and here I have to import this, and I have to copy this information, and I need to pass the session as well. Okay, cool. So this configuration is also done. So all the components are handled with the session provider. So there has to be session. Now you can see what you have to do is, from the front end you have to add the different hooks. So use session hook is provided. So this use session hook you can use to get the session, and you can see there is a sign in and sign out also there. So if you want to sign in and sign out, you have to use this components. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we will do, we will go to the index.js. So here we will be defining the server-side rendering because Next.js provides server-side rendering. So what we'll do, we have to do over here is, when we start our application, if we have session available, then fine, we can go to the application. But if we don't have session available, then redirect back to the authentication page where we will do the Facebook authentication, and from the Facebook authentication, once we get the session back, directly inject the session. So what I'm doing over here is, I want to get the session directly when the page loads itself. I want the session directly from the server when the page is loading. I don't want that page is loaded and then the session is loaded. Okay, so that's why server side rendering comes into picture. So to add the server side rendering, it's very simple. You just have to create one asynchronous export function. So I'll just define export async function get server side props, and this will take the context as the input parameter, and here what we have to do is we have to use the get session. So if you see here, we have to use the use session. Okay, so I'll just define constant session equals to await get session, and this get session is from the next auth react, and this next session will take the context as an input. Okay, once we get the session, let me make it equal to over here, and once we get the session we will return the props. So I'll just define return, and inside this props session. Okay, and this session, whatever I am returning as a props, that I will inject here, because I am returning as a props, so I can inject it here. Now here I am just defining, like if I have a session, right, if I am logged in, I can call this return. Otherwise, if I don't have a session, I want to redirect you to the login page. So I'll just check here, if there is no session, then return login page, else return this page. Now I have not created the login page yet, so let me create the login component. So I'll just create the login.js rfce. Okay, and here I'll define nav bar, because I want that navigation bar, and after that I want div to have a button that says login. Okay, so for that I'm creating button. Inside div I'll just create one div, and inside div I'll create one button. So this will have a class name equals to container, and I'll just add the horizontal margin as auto and vertical margin as 8, so there is a gap from the nav bar for this button. And I'll just define the height for container of this button, that is h of 12, and this button will say sign in, and this button will have a class name as rounded bg blue 600, text as white, px of 6, py of 2, font as semi bold. Okay, now this is a sign in button. Now when you click on this sign in, it should redirect to the Next.js authentication. So in that Next.js authentication, whatever the authentication provider you have configured, all those links would be there, and you can log in with any of those. So let me just add the on click over here, and in this I'll just define sign in, and this sign in you can see that is from the next.auth/react. That's it, that's done. Okay, now let me just restart the app. Okay, the app is started. Now if I go to the browser and if I refresh the page, there is something missing. There is nothing was returned from render. This usually means that return statement is missing. Okay, so the issue is that if I go to the index.js, I have not imported this login component. So let me just import it. And so if I go to the app.js, okay, so you can see that it's in the my app. So if I go over here, I have not added the return statement, I forgot, so let's add that. Okay, now this should work, and here you can see that I have not logged into my application. No, so it's showing me sign in function. So once I click on sign in, you can see that this is the Next.js authentication. It's asking me to sign in with Facebook because I have only configured Facebook provider. So if I click on Facebook, it will redirect me to give the authentication details for Facebook, and once I logged in, once I will log in, it will redirect me back to my application. So let me just click on sign in with Facebook. You can see that it's asking me for authorization. Okay, so I'll just continue as Shabir. So I have redirected back, so my application is working now. Okay, now I still don't know that I'm logged in or not. So once I logged in, if there is some information over here that which particular user is logged in, then that would be good. So let's add that information, which particular user is logged in. So if I go to the nav bar, okay, here I can add the information. So first of all, what I want is I want to get the session. So to get the session, we need to use the use session hook. So So I'll just do use session, and I'll just define constant data from session. Okay, and status. Okay, I'm taking this two information, and after this p tag, what I want is, if session is there, then create a div. Inside this div, I'll use the image tag to show the image, and this image is from the next image. Okay, and alongside that I will also show the p tag where I will show the user logged in. So here I'll just define, if session is there, then dot user dot name, and in the image src, if session is there, then dot user dot image. Okay, now let me add the style for this as well. I'll just define class name equals to flex, all the items should be center, after sm space x of 2, justify, and so everything is at the right side. And for this paragraph tag, text should be white and font should be bold. And for this image, what I'll do, there are few mandatory properties, so let me just add those properties. Height equals to 30, width equals to 30, layout equals to fixed, and I'll just give the title as well, click to log out. Okay, and this image I'll make it as a clickable. So when you click on this, I'll just call the sign out function, and this sign out is from the next.auth react, and I'll just define properties as well. So it should be rounded full, and cursor I'm just defining as pointer. Okay, so I'm just showing the image and the name as well, whoever is signed in. So if I go back, if I refresh, you can see that I'm getting the error, because in Next.js you have to add the configuration which particular domains that you are using for a particular image. So currently you can see that the domain is this one, that is platform.lookaside.fbsbx.com. so this is something that we have to configure for our images. So let's do that. If I go to the next.config.js, here in this configuration I need to define the image, and inside this image I need to define the domains, and this will be the array. So here I'll define the value, that is the domain. I'll just remove all the other thing. Okay, and once you add the configuration, you need to restart your server. You can see that found a change in next.config.js. Restart the server to see the changes in effect. So let me just restart the server, and if I go back, if I refresh, voila, you can see that I'm getting my name as well, and I'm getting my profile picture as well. I can go ahead and do all the functionalities. Okay, everything is working fine. Edit, delete, all the things. Now if I click on this image, you can see that I've defined that click to log out. So once I click on it, my session will expire and I'll be logged out of the application, and I'll be redirected back to the login page. You can see that now I'm redirected back. If I sign in again, log in with Facebook, and I'm signed in, I'm getting all the details. Okay, so you can see that my entire application is been authenticated using the Facebook, and once I'm authenticated, then only I'll be able to log in and I'll be able to do all the operations. So you can see that this is a full-fledged application. So if you want to implement, you can go ahead and implement with other functionalities as well, and you can share all the details with me. I would be love to see all those builds. So in this video, you can see that we covered a lot of things. We covered the backend application, that is a Spring Boot application. In that, we created the different APIs with the help of Spring Data JPA and the MySQL backend database as well. And for the UI, we created the application using the Next.js. In that, we use the Tailwind CSS to create our UI. We also touch around the headless UI to create the different components that are available for Tailwind. And we also use the Next.js authentication to authenticate our application using the Facebook authentication. There are different bunch of providers available. If you want, you can go ahead and add the different providers as well. It's very easy. You just have to create the application there. If you are using GitHub or Twitter, create the application, get the client ID, secret ID, configure here, and that's it. You're good to go. So I'll share the code and every details with you. I'll share the GitHub link in the description below so you can check that out and you can use this application as well. And you can build around on this application. If you have any doubts or anything, then do let me know in the comment section below. I will try to help you as soon as possible. So if you have enjoyed this tutorial, then give us a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for the upcoming videos. If you are interested in such kind of builds, then do let me know in the comment section below. I will try to implement more and I will share those with you. And if you want to learn more about Spring, Spring Boot and creating microservices with it, these are the videos. You can check those out. So that's been it in this tutorial. I will see you in the next video. Till then, happy coding. Bye bye.